prior to his current position, Phil directed large whale research at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. He remains associated with the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and for many years he directed long-term study of individually identified humpback whales in the Gulf of Maine. Phil has published around 130 peer-reviewed papers on whales and other cetaceans, as well as 5 books. I've been hearing him about him for years. He's a legend in the whale world. We're honored to have him here, Dr. Phil Cloud.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, and a very big thank you to Whale Trust for inviting me to come out here, and more importantly, getting me out of the Pacific Northwest in winter. Go Seahawks! Yeah. Come from a small town that just won a rather small championship. Let's see. So, it happens to be my 58th birthday today. That is not a good thing. And I was telling Megan the other night that there are certain transitional events that happen in one's life from which one never recovers, and one of these happened to me about 3 weeks ago. I had been living under the happy delusion that I could maybe pass still for a guy in his late 40s, on a good day in dim lighting. And I was in a grocery store, and for the first time ever in my life, the clerk said to me, "Sir, are you over 60 for the discount?" It was fortunate indeed for her that my purchases that day did not include a baseball bat. That said, it has been my privilege and my great good fortune to work with these remarkable animals for about 30 years now. I got into the whale business entirely by accident in 1980, and in the ensuing 33 years, the whales have given me a really wonderful career, an even more wonderful wife, and they have given me some extraordinary moments of great beauty. If any of you or your kids are contemplating a career in whale research, then I will tell you that it's a very competitive field. It involves lousy money and a lot of sacrifice, but it also involves some extraordinary moments. And as a scientist, you get to be paid to be curious, essentially, and you also get to go to some remarkable places. Just to give you an idea, this is one of them. This is off Unalaska Island, a pair of humpback whales on the Macashin volcano and the Aleutians in the Bering Sea. The Aleutians are kind of like the horrible weather version of Hawaii. If they're not shrouded in rain and fog, which they are a lot of the time, they are among the most beautiful places in the world. And they're also host to one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen, which is that every summer you have millions of short-tailed shearwaters, which are seabirds that migrate there from Australia. And they come to feed on krill and various other things. And if you're lucky and you're in the right place at the right time, you can see 1 or 2 of them. Of course, if, like Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory, you're an ornithophobe, this is not a good place to be. It's kind of like being in a Hitchcock movie. But there are really birds as far as you can see. It's just an extraordinary phenomenon. And if you can imagine adding to that 60 or 70 humpback whales lunging through the surface and feeding, coming through these big carpets of birds, it's really quite extraordinary. So I don't know how I got this old, but I feel very blessed. I've worked with most big whales at one time or another, but humpbacks remain and always will be my first love. And so I'm going to tell you a bit about humpbacks today and how they're doing in the world, in this modern world of ours. And some of the images in here are mine. The best ones are from my friend Colin Baxter, who's also here today. And Colin and I have just published this book, shameless promotion here. I'm really, really happy. I can't tell you how happy I am to have Colin's images in here, because this is an event involving Flip Nicklin, and not to mention some other wonderful photographers. I once had to immediately follow Flip Nicklin with my own crummy images in a talk. And the only thing I can compare that to is being given a public IQ test right after Stephen Hawking. So I'm very grateful to Colin for providing some images here. Oh, the disclaimer. So I'm actually not here in an official capacity today, so anything I say is my opinion and not that of Noah or any of the following individuals. especially Justin Bieber. So I think everyone in this room probably knows as much about humpback whales as I do, and they're coming back really well. They really are a resilient whale. But in order to talk about the present and the future of humpback whales, unfortunately we do have to delve into the past, and there are some, you've seen some wonderful images today of some of the best in the world of living animals. And unfortunately I'm going to show you some ones of dead ones, because I do think it's important to keep in mind what we've done to this species in the past. Remember, this does have a happy ending, I think. So as far as whaling is concerned, the first regular commercial whaling that we know about for humpback whales was probably in Japan in the 16th century. Up in the top left here you can see this old image. There was a net whaling operation. Whales would be driven into nets by fishermen. They still are actually in Japan today. In the 19th century, these two big maps in the middle, the American sail-based whaling industry, this is the era of Herman Melville. They hunted humpbacks in various places. They weren't really a primary target of whalers for the most part. The oil that humpback whales gave was smaller in quantity than some of the other whales, and the baleen was of very poor quality relative to right whales and bowheads, for example. But nonetheless, they were taken by whalers in the 19th century in some of these places. Now, up until the late 19th century, whalers have been constrained by their own technology, essentially. That all changed towards the end of the century with two inventions. One was the steam engine, which allowed whalers to suddenly pursue even the fastest whales they couldn't have caught before, like blue and fin whales. And the other was the explosive harpoon, which allowed whalers to kill whales very effectively from a distance, which they hadn't been able to do before. You know, in Herman Melville's day, they had to almost literally get up on the back of the whale and harpoon it. The explosive harpoon was the brainchild of actually two people. Sven Foyn on the left here, who was a Norwegian whaler and sealer, and his invention was the one that became adopted by the whaling industry. Somewhat less successful was an American, Thomas Walton Royce, on the right here. And Royce, as you may be able to see in this photograph, actually did succeed in blowing off his left arm when the gun he was using exploded. Undeterred, he then, and ever the opportunist, he placed some ads in newspapers about his new product saying, "So simple you can use it with one hand." So towards the end of the 19th century, we have coastal whaling stations springing up in various places in the world, and they feature these steam-powered catchers with bow-mounted harpoon cannons like the one on the top left here. And unfortunately, because humpbacks are often coastal in their distribution, they were often one of the first species to be targeted, and they often killed them until they were gone, essentially. The graph here is the catch levels for two whaling stations in Northern California in the 1920s, and with the exception of 1921, when the price of oil collapsed. You can see they were taking several hundred humpbacks until suddenly the population crashes about 1925. They switch to other species, and by 1926 it's all over, and the station closes because there aren't any more whales. And this is a pretty typical pattern in many places in the world. But the real playground of modern whaling was not in the Northern Hemisphere, but in the Antarctic. In 1903, another Norwegian, Carl Larsen here, visited South Georgia in the South Atlantic, and he famously wrote, "I see them in hundreds and thousands." There were staggering numbers of whales there, and throughout the Antarctic in general, millions of whales that had been completely untapped as a whaling resource before. So he went back in 1904, built a whaling station in South Georgia, and from then on, a huge slaughter began. Then in the 1920s, we see the introduction of the final innovation, the factory ship, which allowed whalers to be free from their ties from land. They didn't have to take the carcasses back to a shore station anymore. They could process them at sea. They would have an attendant fleet of catchers that would kill whales, deliver them to the factory ship, and as a result, whalers could go anywhere, and no whale anywhere was safe. And with that, a really extraordinary slaughter began. In the 1930s alone, 150,000 blue whales were killed in the Antarctic. In the 1950s, 250,000 fin whales died at the hands of whalers, and the total 20th century catch for the Southern Hemisphere was about 2 million whales. And if you look at the numbers here, some of them are staggering. 369,000 blue whales, 720,000 fin whales in the Antarctic, 400,000 sperm whales, 220,000 humpbacks. So in 1946, even the whaling nations realized that they had to try to regulate themselves or they would be whaling themselves out of business. So they got together after a number of unsuccessful attempts and they created and signed the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling. And the purpose of this was, as Flip said this morning, was not to preserve the whales for the whales' sake, it was to try to make the industry sustainable for a long-term future. And along with this, they were protected species. Gray whales and right whales were protected completely. There were size limits put on, the minimum size of a whale that you could kill, and everyone had to report their catches to the International Whaling Commission. The International Whaling Commission was created by this convention in 1946, and it still oversees whaling today. And everyone signs this, including, significantly, the Soviet Union. Well, despite this, I won't say noble attempt to introduce some conservation or common sense into whaling, in the 1950s, you had the usual problem of overcapitalization. Everyone's out there at the beginning when the resource is abundant, puts a lot of money into equipment, the resource goes downhill, there's tremendous incentive to deny the fact that there's a problem. And that despite evidence of declining stocks through the 50s, there was sustained high catches which were voted in by the International Whaling Commission. So in other words, by the end of the 1950s, what we knew was happening was really bad. But it turns out that things were even worse than we imagined. And this is something of a detective story now. So in 1965, there is an Australian whale biologist who died last year, Graham Chiddleborough, who wrote a classic paper about the dynamics of two populations of humpback whale. And these were the populations of whales that migrate from the Antarctic up the east and west coast of Australia, where they were killing them. And he was using these samples to look at the populations. And in 1965, Chiddleborough says, in the middle of this big paper, something's wrong here. These figures don't add up. The only way to explain this is the existence of large unreported catches. In other words, someone's out there killing lots of whales and not reporting them. And he didn't say who he suspected it was, and the Whaling Commission, despite the fact this was brought up, completely ignored it. So fast forward 30 years, and in 1992, a chance series of conversations occurred between three biologists, which led to a major revelation. Peter Best up here, who is a biologist in South Africa, was trying to publish a paper estimating the length of gestation and pregnancy in right whales. And the way you do that is you look at dead females and you look at the length of fetuses over time. The problem was that right whales have been protected completely since 1935, so there were really very few carcasses to look at, just a few stranded animals and one or two others. So he happened to mention this to Bob Brownell down here on the left, and just by chance, sometime later, Bob mentioned it to his Russian friend Alexei Yablokov, who at the time was the science advisor to President Boris Yeltsin. And Yablokov had been involved actually with whales in his career as well, and so Alexei stunned Bob by saying, we can give Peter some data on pregnant females. And Bob said, what do you mean, how many? Thinking he was going to say half a dozen. And he said, several hundred. The idea that somebody would have data on hundreds of pregnant female right whales, a species that had been completely protected since 1935, in theory, was just inconceivable. And that's when Yablokov revealed that now the Cold War is over, I can tell you that the Soviet Union was conducting a massive campaign of illegal whaling, starting in 1948 and going on for 30 years, and we kept it all secret. So following that, a number of former Soviet biologists who had, often at considerable personal risk to themselves, kept the true catch data, because the Soviets did actually keep the secret catch data, the true data. These guys got together and they reconstructed the true catch record. This is Dmitry Tomasov, who's a good friend of ours, and Dmitry, this guy took 57,000 catch records from one of the big factory fleets and hid them in his potato cellar in Kaliningrad for 30 years until after the Cold War, and it's due to him that we actually know we have the whole catch record for that fleet now. That was done by several guys for the Antarctic. The job of reconstructing the North Pacific data fell to my lovely wife, Yulia Ivashenko, who went through more reports than she cared to remember from Soviet archives. These are all formerly secret Soviet whaling reports where all the true data were, and they've all been declassified. She managed to find them, and as a result, the North Pacific catch record has been corrected also. So why did this happen? Well, and this is really largely Yulia's work here. In order to understand this, you have to understand the sort of bizarre nature of the Soviet planning system. Everything in the Soviet Union, in the economy, was based upon industrial planning and on targets set for every industry. And meeting or exceeding those targets was something that there was tremendous pressure to do that, and the only way you could get honors and awards, and more importantly, cash bonuses, was to do that. So here's how it worked for the whaling industry. So the Ministry of Fisheries would set a target for a factory fleet for a year. This is how many whales you have to kill. And if the fleet worked hard and they managed to meet that target, they would get a 25% bonus, which was a big deal. If, however, they exceeded the target by 20%, they would get a bonus of 60%, which was a huge deal, not to mention honors and awards. The problem was that the ministry would then take the catch total for that year and use that as the new target for the following year. And of course, that meant that targets were ratcheted up and up, and the whale population simply could not withstand this. The Soviets were very good at doing this. The big factory ship up here is the Sovietska Rossiya, which was the biggest of all the factory ships ever built, actually, by anyone. This factory ship, with its attendant fleet of about 25 catches, could kill and process 100 humpbacks or 200 sperm whales in a day. And just to put that in perspective, 200 sperm whales in a day is more sperm whales than a New England whaling ship from New Bedford or Nantucket on a 5-year voyage would kill, in many cases, in 5 years. And unfortunately, there was also tremendous inefficiency and waste. The catchers were sometimes delivering whales to the factory ship faster than they could process them, so some of the carcasses would rot, or they would strip the blubber and then throw the rest of it overboard. But all these got to be counted against the production target. There were a number of biologists who were working with the Soviet whaling industry who were just horrified at this and what it meant not only for the populations of whales but also for the sustainability of this enterprise. And you read comments like this in some of the reports. But because of this mania to attain these targets and exceed them, these comments were usually ignored. And you read some very heartbreaking things in some of the reports that Yulia has gone through. This is one of them relating to the North Pacific, where sperm whales were the biggest catch, and where they really, quite literally wiped them out from a lot of areas. So let's go back to humpbacks. In the Southern Hemisphere, between 1948 and the 1970s, the Soviet Union reported officially to the International Whaling Commission that they took 2,710 humpbacks. The actual number was almost 49,000. Amazingly, almost 26,000 of those were taken in just 2 Antarctic whaling seasons, 59-60, 60-61, most of them by 2 factory fleets. And even though nobody knew what was going on at the time, you can see the impact of those catches in the Australian shore-based fishery. These are 2 whaling stations from the eastern coast of Australia, where the whales are migrating up the east coast of Australia from the Antarctic, where the Soviets are killing them. And you can see they're taking their quota of 700 or 800 whales quite happily until these big catches in 60-61, and suddenly the population crashes, and by 63 it was all over and the station closed. And the same thing happened in New Zealand. In all, the difference between what the Soviets said they took and what they actually took in the Southern Hemisphere was about 150,000 animals. I don't want to leave you with the impression that these are the only bad guys out there. I mean, they were doing this certainly illegally, killing everything that crossed the bow of their catcher vessel. But you know, this was in addition to what the other nations were doing in so-called legal whaling with these really unrealistically high catch figures, catch quotas that were given. So everyone's to blame. They just finished it off. So how is the species doing today, despite this attempt to wipe it out? And as I said, I'm very happy to report that, for the most part, humpbacks are doing really well in most of the places that we're studying. There are a few exceptions. One of these is up here in the Arabian Sea. This is a very weird population. It's the only non-migratory population of humpback whales in the world. It's a population that lives year-round, winter and summer, in the Arabian Sea. It doesn't make any long-distance migrations. It's always been small, very likely, and this is also a Soviet leftover. In 1965, a Soviet factory ship coming from Odessa went through the Suez Canal on its way south to the Antarctic for the winter season, the summer season, and they killed 224 humpbacks in 10 days, and that was probably a big chunk of the population. Today, that population is estimated at about 80 to 100 animals, has lots of issues relating to entanglement and fishing gear, and not to mention the huge amount of shipping that's going through the Gulf. Another one is one that I work with a lot in Oceania. I'm not too worried about this population. It's probably around 4,000 animals. In the North Atlantic, the most recent population estimate we have, which is 20 years old now, was 11,500 animals. And I would be very surprised if it's not a good deal larger now. Certainly in some of the areas that these animals are under study, in the Gulf of Maine and off Greenland, there appears to be a very strong increase in the population, anywhere from 3 to 7% per year. So they seem to be doing very well. By the way, there are only 2 places in the world where humpback whales are still hunted. Neither of them are commercial hunts. One of them is down in the Caribbean, in the Southeast Caribbean, in the tiny island of Bequia in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. That's a native operation, and it's one which began in the year 1876 when a Bequia Islander took ship aboard a whaling ship from Provincetown, Massachusetts on Cape Cod, learned the business of whaling, and then went back to Bequia and started a whaling station. The whaling continues there today. The other one is also in the North Atlantic. If that's for me, I'm busy. The other one is up in Greenland, where the native Inuits have recently been given a quota to take humpback whales. That's the first time since 1986 when humpback whale hunting was banned there, and that hunt is rather controversial right now. But overall, North Atlantic doing very well. So the Antarctic. There are 7 populations recognized by the International Whaling Commission, and those are defined actually by their breeding areas, the places they migrate to mate and calve in the tropics, not by the Antarctic itself. These populations, as you've seen from these figures earlier, were reduced by probably 95% or more. But today, amazingly, most of them seem to be doing really well. The big standouts here are the 2 Australian populations, which are really coming back gangbusters. In the middle, that estimate of 41,500 is actually an estimate for Antarctic waters south of 60 degrees south. So in other words, it's the same whales, but just counted in a different place. So if you add up all the red numbers here from the breeding areas, you get a guesstimate of about 80,000 animals, which is pretty good. And I suspect that that is an underestimate because there's just lots of places where humpbacks exist that we don't get to study them because they're too remote or too difficult to get to. Big question is, well, how many were there originally before whaling started playing havoc with them? We don't know for sure. No one's done that calculation, although it's been done for a couple of the separate breeding populations. I would guess, given that there were about 220,000 humpbacks taken in the 20th century over the entire period, I would guess probably somewhere between 100 and 150,000 animals. So that population is coming back pretty well today. And finally, we come to our backyard here in the North Pacific. This is where humpbacks were also hunted, not nearly to the extent that they were in the Antarctic, but then the population was never as large as it was in the Antarctic. This is a map of most of the catches of humpback whales for the 20th century, 27,000 in all. And this is all the offshore ones are primarily taken by the Soviet Union and Japan in their pelagic fleets. The Soviets also killed several thousand more humpbacks here than they reported, by the way. So because of some of the people in this room and many others working diligently in the North Pacific for many years, we know a good deal about this population. And in particular, the last few years, there has been this extraordinary study, the SPLASH study, which has combined many, many researchers from a total of 9 different countries working in all these different places using the same methods, which is primarily photo identification and also biopsy sampling, where you take a very small sample for genetic analysis, and you can also identify the whale from that too. So this has gone on for several years, and it's given us an extraordinary view, sort of overview of humpback whales today in the North Pacific. The main objectives of this study were to calculate the abundance and also the trend in the population, to look at the population structure. That's really important. Is it one big population, or is it a bunch of smaller subpopulations? And also to look at some human impacts. So because of thousands of photographs and thousands of biopsy samples that were taken over these five sampling periods, people put all those together, they matched them, they came up with lots of different matches where whales were seen in one area and then photographed or biopsy samples in another. And this is the picture we see of population structure in the North Pacific. You can see these migratory connections, Hawaiian whales going up to Alaska and some other places, and then separate breeding areas in other places. In fact, we currently estimate that there are 13 separate populations of humpbacks in the North Pacific. And from this SPLASH project, we have an estimate that we have pretty high confidence in, that over the entire North Pacific, there are about 21,000 humpback whales. And the population seems to be growing at about probably 3.5% a year overall. Not true of all populations, by the way. There's one in the Western Pacific, in Russia, which is certainly the smallest of all of them. I think it will probably come back rather well. But at the moment, at least, it's the one that we're looking at most closely. So the big question is, this population is doing really well. Is it time to remove them from the endangered species list? And I would stress these are my opinions and not those of my agency. Some of you are probably aware that last April, the Hawaii Fishermen's Association actually put in a petition to the National Marine Fisheries Service to delist North Pacific humpback whales. And the agency actually, coincidentally, has had a status review going on for several years where we look at the status of all populations of humpbacks. There is what's called a biological review team, which I'm a member of, which is responsible for reviewing the best available science and making recommendations. The agency has until April this year to make a decision on this, to say yes or no. And I'm not going to tell you how it's going to come out because I don't know and I don't get to make that decision. I will, however, give you my own view of things. Actually, first of all, the only species of large whale that has been removed from the endangered species list so far is the gray whale in 1994. That was the eastern gray whale, the one that migrates from Mexico to California up to Alaska. This population today is doing very well. It's probably around 20,000 animals. It's a real success story in conservation. Despite that, there actually has been a move by persons I shall not name to try to relist this population. I was trying to think of a way to say this in a subtle way, but this is really not a smart idea. You know, if you try to relist a population that doesn't need it, then what you're doing essentially is debasing the whole concept of endangered species. You're just giving ammunition to the conservatives who think that environmentalists are never satisfied. And you're also taking resources away from populations that really do need it. And I would argue that if you are going to take a course célèbre in the North Pacific, this is the whale you should be considering. This is the eastern North Pacific right whale. We estimated the population recently at 30 animals. And that's in the Bering Sea. I'm sure it's a bit more than that, but it's certainly not a hell of a lot more than that. This is also a Soviet leftover. They were heavily hunted in the 19th century by American pelagic whaling. They were just probably beginning to come back at a reasonable rate, and then the Soviets went in the 60s and killed almost 700 of them. And that was probably the bulk of the population. So this is the species that really does need assistance. And unfortunately, there's no funding for this at all at the moment. So my view is two things. First of all, the North Pacific is not one population. So the idea of delisting the entire North Pacific, for me, is a non-starter. It's clearly more than one population. We think it's 13 currently. Personally, I think that you could make a very strong argument that the population out here in Hawaii is a very good candidate for either downlisting from endangered to threatened or delisting completely. They seem to be doing extremely well, and as you can see, if you just step out of the door here and look out, as Jim said, there's thousands of them. Probably, we don't know exactly how many. We're working up that estimate right now, but probably in the range of 8,000 to 10,000 animals. One of Colin's more amusing photos here. So overall, I think humpbacks have a very good future. There are certainly a few issues that they still we're still concerned about. They do get entangled in fishing gear and die in some places. There are the potential impacts of noise and pollution. And then there's the big one, which is climate change. We have no idea what the impact of climate change is going to be on these animals. It may be negative, it may be positive. Interestingly, we're starting to see now, my program does a lot of work in the Arctic, and we're starting to see humpback whales pushing north into areas in the Arctic where they haven't been seen in quite a long time. And that may well be a result of increasing loss of sea ice, opening up new habitat for them. So, on the other hand, if there is massive ecosystem disruption because of climate change, and if you think of things like ocean acidification and various other nightmare scenarios, that certainly isn't out of the realm of possibility. If that's the case, then humpbacks, along with everything else, are going to have a very hard time. But overall, I don't really worry about humpbacks. I worry about certain things like, why didn't I start a retirement fund early enough? Whether my daughter will ever figure out what she wants to do with her life. But I don't worry about humpbacks. I think they have a great future. And on that note, I was going to leave you with a traditional breaching humpback photo, but I can't compete with all these wonderful photos that the photographers here did, so I'm going to leave you with my favorite piece of internet humor, which cracks me up every time. It's another mammal. Aww.